Hi friends, welcome back to Hebraic Creations. Last time I said that we would talk about what could be the most unusual Torah command. Not only is it an unusual mandate, but the associated Hebrew word sounds pretty funny. Tzitzit. It means tassels. These little tassels are supposed to be attached to our clothes. And with the Jewish tradition, they're typically attached to a prayer shawl or a tallit. That explains why Jews wear these, but would Yehovah require Christians to wear them as well? That's a good question. Let's begin our discussion with Numbers chapter 15, verses 38 through 40. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the sons of Israel and tell them that they shall make for themselves tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and that they shall put on the tassels of each corner a cord of blue. It shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commands of the Lord, to do them and not follow after your own heart and your own eyes, after which you played the harlot, so that you may remember to do all my commands and be holy to your God." In those three verses, we find the word tassels 3 times. I think they're repeated for reinforcement. In the King James Version of the Bible, instead of tassels on the corners, take note that it says fringe of the borders. It still means tzitzit. There are 5 things this Torah passage tells us. First, we wear tassels to remind us to do all Yehovah's commands. I think it's repeated twice for emphasis, so we need to pay attention. And notice we're to do all his commands, not just some of them. Second, the tassels should be something we look at, so they should be visible, not necessarily hidden. Third, this rule is to be followed throughout our generations, which means forever. Fourth, there's no age or gender specified. Therefore, everyone, men, women, and children, should observe. Fifth, a blue thread should be included and tends to stand out nicely when tied with white. But as long as blue is included, other colors are not forbidden. It's interesting that many Jews use no blue at all because of uncertainty over the exact shade of blue used in ancient times. But this is an example of rabbinic lawlessness to exclude the blue altogether. Again, the Hebrew word for tassels or fringes is tzitzit. That is the Strong's word number 6734. The only other Old Testament use of tzitzit is where it's translated as lock, meaning a lock of hair. That's in Ezekiel chapter 8, verses 3. He, Yehovah, stretched out the form of a hand and caught me by the lock of my head, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven. The prophet's describing being picked up by Tzitzit Rashi, or the head tzitzit. Some think this is the reason for the traditional peyot, or those super long hair curls worn by the Orthodox. There are other words that denote tassels in the Old Testament. Only one time in the law are the tassels fringes called gedeel. That's Strong's number 1434. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 12. You shall make tassels on the 4 corners of the clothing which you cover yourself. Gedeel in that passage means twisted threads and describes the tassels being tied into chain-like knots. So with only 4 mentions of tzitzit and only 1 mention of gedeel in the Old Testament, it seems like an extremely obscure mandate. Other than the law, I couldn't think of any place in the scriptures that mentions these things. However, there are other places in the Old Testament where tzitzit are mentioned, but instead of tassels or fringes, there's other words used. Skirt, hem, robe, and even the word wing. There are 2 Hebrew words used in these cases. The first one is shul. That's Strong's number 7757. And the second one is kanaph. That's Strong's number 3671. Kanaph is the most frequently used, and we find it in Psalms that talk about being under the shadow of Yehovah's wings. These could be referring to the Father's tasseled tallit. I don't know, it's my view. You might want to test that out. And if that seems like a stretch, consider Ezekiel chapter 16, verses 8, that says, I, Yehovah, spread my skirt, kanaph, tassels, over thee. If the Father also wears a tasseled garment, it must carry some element of importance. Could it possibly carry his presence? Look at Zechariah chapter 8, verses 23. Thus says the Lord of hosts, in those days 10 men from every language of the nations shall grasp the sleeve of a Jewish man, kanaph or tassels, saying, let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you. Wow, God is with you. That's interesting that they grab the tzitzit while saying that. Like they know this is the one thing that really visibly sets the Jewish people apart. I thought it was odd that the English word sleeve was used, though. That's really far from the hemline. So I looked it up on BibleHub.com and discovered that there are 8 different English words used for kanaph in the verse among the modern translations. They use the word sleeve, robe, garment, skirt, clothes, hem of the robe, hem of the garment, and even shirt. This shows how very obscure the tzitzit mandate becomes with poor Bible translations. So I went digging for other hidden places, considering the use of kanaph in the book of Ruth. Look at chapter 2, verse 12. Boaz notes that she is someone who's come for refuge under Yehovah's wing. I believe he may have been taking note of 2 things. First, she was making the land her home by moving to Israel with her mother-in-law. And second, she was making the religion her own, possibly by wearing a woman's tallit, even though she was not a native-born Jew. Later in Ruth chapter 3, verses 9, Ruth asks Boaz to cover her with his wing or skirt. Kanaph is the word. I suspect the word kanaph in both Ruth verses was referring to the tasseled tallit worn by everyone. But again, you will want to test that out for yourself. I found some other obscure, what I thought to be tzitzit references in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 27. As Samuel turned around to go away, Saul seized the edge of his robe and it tore. The King James calls this kanaph reference the skirt of his mantle, which doesn't really make sense. Again, this looks like to me a veiled reference to a tasseled tallit. Here's another one, another kanaph reference. It's in 1 Samuel 24, verses 4. It's where David cuts off a corner of Saul's robe while he's sleeping instead of killing him. The King James says skirt of Saul's robe, which also makes no sense unless you recognize this is also possibly talking about tassels on a tallit. In verse 5 through 6 of the same chapter, it says, afterward, David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe, kanaph, and he said to his men, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed. I always thought it was really odd that David spared Saul's life, but felt bad for ruining his clothes. It makes more sense that he was convicted about desecrating a sacred garment. And clipping off one of Saul's tallit tassels is more of an affront if you consider that it made Saul no longer Torah compliant and actually placed him into the realm of lawlessness. The sanctity of tallit becomes clear when you consider the word mantle, which is most likely the same thing, but again, you test it. There are a few Hebrew words for mantle, but we'll focus on adereth, which is Strong's number 155. It's found in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 13. This is where Elijah threw his mantle on Elisha when he was called to disciple the younger man. Later we see this mantle or tallit used to perform a miracle in 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 8. Elijah parted the Jordan with this mantle, and he and Elisha crossed over on dry ground. Then in 2 Kings chapter 2, 13 through 14, Elisha does the same miracle, also using Elijah's mantle, which he inherited after Elijah was caught away by a chariot of fire. The last scripture we will examine is in Malachi chapter 4, verse 2, where kanaph or tassels, is used in a messianic prophecy. But to you who fear my name, the Son of Righteousness shall arise with healing in his wings. This is where we will wrap up our look at Tzitzit in the Old Testament. Next time we'll look at the New Testament and see how this prophecy in Malachi was fulfilled and uncover other hidden references to Tzitzit. So stay tuned. Shalom.